Welcome everyone to the 13th Blender art critique video on my channel. Now, I do apologize that this video is a little late. I was really busy working on finishing up that Martian environment Blender tutorial series. I'll leave a link in the description if you'd like to check out that course. And if you'd like to purchase the course, that would be a great way to help support me and this YouTube channel. And thank you so much everyone who's purchased the course so far. I really do appreciate your support and I hope you enjoy the course. So over the past month, people have been submitting their artwork to be critiqued, and if you'd like your artwork to be in the next critique video, then you could submit it through the Google form. I'll have the link in the description. So people submit their artwork throughout the month, and then on the first day of each month, I go through all these submissions and I figure out which ones I want to critique, and then I create the critique video as soon as I can at the beginning of each month. Now, I'm not able to critique all of the artwork that is submitted, so I do apologize if your artwork didn't make it in the video, but thank you everyone for submitting your artwork. So these are all of the artworks that I'm going to be critiquing in this video. So let's jump right into it. So this first artwork comes from BlendB, and BlendB was wondering how to get better lighting and composition. So this is a very cool artwork here. I really like the main subject that you have, this cool bridge here, and I think the flowers and I think the grass looks really good, and I also really like the trees that you added and the background, and I also think the lighting is really quite good. And also I really like these things here, these little like concrete pieces with like the little bit of moss. That is really nice as well. Let's go over how I would critique it. So I'm not quite sure what these are, but I'm pretty sure they're butterflies, but I think there's way too many butterflies, and also they're all in one place because it looks like all the butterflies are kind of just in a big plane. It almost looks like there's a plane kind of right before the water, and all of the butterflies are only right there. There's not any butterflies farther back, there's not any butterflies closer up, they're all just right there in that one spot. So I think giving it more depth would really help, so making some butterflies farther back and some butterflies closer, and then also maybe making a little bit more variation, so making some different types of butterflies, maybe some different colors, but also I think there's just way too many butterflies. Like, I've never seen this many butterflies in one place before. I don't know for sure, but I don't think butterflies really hang out all together in that huge of a group, so I would make less butterflies and then giving them some different depth and maybe changing the colors of some of them to make them look different. And then the next thing that I would do is I would make the water less lumpy, because it does look quite lumpy. It's really bumpy, and it does kind of look like a small river or something, so the water would be moving, but it is really bumpy. What I would do is I would make it more smooth, but then I would just add a little bit of fine detail, maybe even in the materials. You could add like a noise texture and put that into the bump, and then maybe add like a little bit of distortion in the noise texture just to add a little bit of bump all around the surface, but it is really lumpy and I think it's too bumpy. And then also right down here, it does look like there is a road, and I think that is really cool. I'm not quite sure if it was meant for like a car or if it was just meant for people. This bridge looks like it was just meant for like people to walk over, but then it looks like there are some almost like track marks, almost like if a car or maybe a tractor was driving over. So I would say try to make that road look a little bit more organic, like people are walking on it, because right now you can see like right there and right there, it almost looks like those are two places where like a car tires would drive over, and then also right there and there. So I would make it a little bit more big, so kind of like over here, some people might walk over here, so kind of get rid of the grass right there. You can still have some grass, you know, if the bridge isn't used a ton, then there would probably be little bits of grass here and there, so that is pretty good, but I would just make that a little bit bigger. And then also I did notice that there isn't really any steps or anything going from the dirt up onto the bridge, so maybe just making the bridge a little bit longer and maybe having it going down into the dirt, or maybe just adding like a couple pieces of wood kind of as steps to kind of go up on the bridge. But that's it really. I do think this is really quite good. I really like the lighting that you added. The lighting looks very realistic, and I really like the textures that you used. And these little concrete lamp things, I think those look really good, especially with the moss on there. And I also really like the flowers and the grass and all that. So that's the critique. I hope this was helpful, and thank you for sending in this artwork. Alright, hopefully I'm pronouncing your name right. So this next artwork comes from Sworope, and specifically you wanted critique about the lighting and the textures. So you actually sent in two different ones. You sent in this one, which I think is really quite nice. I really like this. I think this would be very nice as like, you know, like a desktop wallpaper or something like that. It is very nice, but then you also sent in another one, and I think this one is a lot better for the critique because it's a lot more interesting and it has a lot more elements. And it also looks like it's sort of similar, like you have the same hills here, like the mountains, and then you also have the sunset. So it kind of looks like maybe this is a part of the scene. right over here. So that is very cool. So I'm going to mostly just be critiquing this artwork here with this house. So this is a really cool scene. I really like the fog that you added, and also like the hills and the mountains in the background, and the sunset is really cool. And I also really like the grass. The grass looks really nice, and you have some water there. And also, I didn't actually notice this for a little while, but there's actually a boat right there in the distance. So that is very cool as well. So let's go over how I would critique this. So you did want critique about the lighting and the textures, and I do think the lighting is pretty good, but there are some issues with the textures, because if you zoom right in here, you can see there are some issues with the displacement. So you can see there's like a little opening right there. There is kind of like something overlapping there. Also, there's like some random little jaggedy bits that are coming out there. And it does look like you used a displacement map, because especially like right here, you can kind of see it popping out. So that is really good. Using a displacement map will really help to make it more realistic, because it's actually popping out of the mesh. But there are a lot of issues like right there. There's like some opening right there, and just some jaggedy bits and things. So I don't exactly know what's going on, but if you could try to work on fixing the displacement, that would really help. And then also there are some stretched UVs, a bunch of different places. You can see the textures placed nicely on the top of that plane right there, but then that little lip there, it's very stretched. You can just see some lines of color. And also right here, there's some stretching. And then also right there is some stretching as well, and over here. So going back and fixing the UVs would really help to make that look better. And then also, I think the boat is very cool. It's a very cool element, but I would make it just a little bit more visible. So maybe adding a rim light to it or something, because it is very cool, but I actually didn't notice it for a while, and then I was like, oh wait a second, there's a boat right there. So just making it slightly more visible, slightly more easy to see. Now for the dock here, it looks like you maybe used a procedural texture. It looks like maybe you used a noise texture, and then you put that into the bump, and also maybe put it into the color, and then made it red. But I don't really feel like that works very well for this. I think it would be much better to either use a procedural wood texture, or just download a wood texture from a website like Ambient CG or CG Bookcase. Just downloading a texture and then adding it on, I think it would be better, because it does just look kind of noisy, and it doesn't really look like wood. So I would get rid of that procedural noise texture and just change it out for a different texture. Now I think remodeling the deck chairs would be really helpful as well, because if I zoom in here, you can see that the modeling is really quite simple, and I don't even think that looks like a chair very much. I don't think that the shapes are quite right, and also I don't think you shaded the object smooth. I'm not quite sure, but it looks like maybe I can see those planes there. So what I would do is just remodel the chairs. So I just grabbed some images online. These are just some ideas of like outdoor porch chairs. You could of course do whatever you want, but I think something like this would be better. Maybe like add a wood texture to it instead of just having it white, but modeling something like this and spending a little bit more time making more details in the chair model, I think that would really help, because these chairs are just pretty simple. And also I don't really like the material on them. They kind of blend in with the rest of the scene here, the rest of the house, and it almost looks like a shiny kind of reddish metal material, which I don't think really makes sense. So I would probably make some sort of lawn chair or porch chair like this, and then maybe I would add a wood texture to it, or if you wanted to go like maybe with this metal or plastic, you could do that. Now going back over to the deck, I do think the deck is way too narrow. With how narrow this deck is, it seems like you would probably want some sort of railing along the deck, and maybe also up on the stairs. If the deck was wider, then it would make sense that maybe you wouldn't need a railing. What I would probably do is make them as wide as the porch here. So that would just make it a lot wider, and it wouldn't be as easy to kind of fall off here into the marshy, grassy water. Now this house is also pretty small, and at first I was thinking maybe it's really small just because maybe it's like a storage shed or something, but it doesn't really make sense that it's a storage shed, because it does have a chimney, and then it also has a nice door and a window, and also like the deck. So it seems like someone would live here, especially with the chairs. It makes sense that someone would live here, but with how small it is, it just doesn't really make sense that someone would live inside something that small. And especially with this chimney here, you would need like a fireplace, and then you need like a bedroom and a kitchen and some other things like that. So I would say either make the house bigger so that it kind of makes sense that someone would be living here, or you could kind of take away the chairs and take away some of the nicer things, maybe take away the chimney, and then it could be maybe just like a storage shed, or maybe this could be just some sort of storage shed for like the boat. Maybe this is like a boat ramp or something, and then this could be a storage shed, maybe just to store different supplies, maybe to store life vests or rope or other gear that you would use when you were boating. So just be more clear with what the building is made for. Is it like a storage shed? Is it maybe just something to store boat supplies, or is it a house that someone lives in? So that's the critique. That's what I would do to improve this artwork. So I think if you improve those things, then this artwork would look really nice. So thank you for sending this in, and I hope the critiques were helpful. Alright, and this next artwork comes from Mohan, and specifically they were wondering what things they should add into the scene. So this is a very cool artwork, I really do like it, and it looks like you did my TV table tutorial. I'll leave a link in the description if you'd like to check that out, but I do really like this scene. I like the picture that you added right here, and then I also like this carpet, that's very cool, and I really do like this TV remote model that you made, that's really great. Let's go over how I would improve this, and then I'll also let you know what kind of stuff I would add into the scene. So the first thing that I would do to improve this is I would make the style more consistent. So this TV table is made out of wood, but then also you added these drawers here and they have like the white material to them, but I feel like that doesn't really make sense and the style is kind of bashing. So I would say either go for more the minimalistic super white table with no textures, or you could go with the wooden table with the wooden textures and change out the white drawers for wooden textures. You could still keep the drawers, but just make the white drawers have a texture instead. And then also I forgot to mark this down in the critique, but I do feel like the wood texture is super shiny, and I do feel like it's too shiny. If you zoom in here, you can see this is like really shiny. It's a very polished, and I just feel like it's so shiny it just doesn't even feel like wood. So I don't know if that was just because of the texture. You probably use the same texture that I used in the tutorial, but I would say go into the texture and just like play around with the roughness. So if you just add like a color ramp right before the roughness value, then you can change the colors, and I would just make it a little bit more rough because right now it's so shiny it almost looks like plastic. So yeah, I would make that less shiny. Now I would also use a different texture for the shelves because the wood texture that you use does have some scratches, and I just don't really like that. I don't really get why there'd be all the scratches there, and then also the scratches seem to be at the same exact location, and that totally doesn't make sense. You can see there's like a little scratch there and there and there and there. So I would change out the texture for a different wood texture and then just use a texture that doesn't have those scratches. And then I would also change the location of the textures on each shelf. So I would say go into the UV mapping and just change it to a different location on the texture so that the texture is different for each shelf. Now on the floor here, I think that the normal map is way too bumpy, so I would turn down the strength of that normal map just because it looks really bumpy, and that doesn't really make sense for a polished wood floor. So I would turn the bump strength or the normal map strength probably like half as bumpy, or maybe even less, because it should be pretty smooth if it's a wood floor. Now I would also add book titles to the books, because the books are all blank, and that just doesn't really make sense. I think it kind of breaks the realism, because usually when you see books on a shelf, you're going to see the little titles. So I would add a texture with some different book titles. So just like write out some random book titles and then stick them on there as a texture onto the books. Now going back to the shelves, I do think the shelves could also be longer because they are pretty short. They're not very long, and usually like shelves like this are longer. So I would definitely make those longer shelves. Now you were wondering what you could add into the scene. So a few ideas that I thought of are maybe like plants, maybe some more books on the shelf. You also might want to add like a clock on the shelf. Maybe you could even add some candles. But the most important thing with what you add is keeping a consistent style or a consistent theme. Because when you're doing architecture scenes, I think it's really important to keep all of the items in the room kind of a similar style. So a really good way to think about this is think about who would actually be living in this home. And whoever is living in this home has different interests, they have different hobbies and things like that. So keep it all similar. Like for instance, I think like adding books and plants would be really good. And maybe also candles would work really well with that. And so maybe the person living here likes books and plants and things like that. Or maybe the person that's living here really really likes things like Rubik's cubes or puzzles or different things like that. So you could go with that style and put different models like maybe a Rubik's cube or maybe a puzzle or some different things like that. Basically just think about who is living in this house and what are their interests, and then put different items in the scene that go together. So that's it for this critique. I hope this was helpful, and thank you for sending this in. All right, hopefully I'm pronouncing your name right. So this next one comes from Neil Kaklatar. So they sent in this very cool scene here with like this cool sci-fi character, and it looks like he's walking into this like dark forest or something, and then there's like this cool structure here in the forest. So this is a very cool artwork. I definitely have some critiques, but this is really cool. So the biggest thing that I would critique is that I feel like the overall style doesn't really match up, because for instance you have like these little beacons up here which look kind of sci-fi and blocky, and they have like some little glowing lights, but then also you have like this little orb thing inside this like glass case, and that looks sort of magical and mysterious, so that's sort of a different style or theme. But then also over here on the trees, it looks like maybe you were going for a low poly look. It's kind of hard to tell because it is a little bit dark, but I can see all these super sharp edges. You can see them a little bit better right up here. It almost looks like you were going for some low poly nature, and also right over here, it looks like these are some bushes, but they're very low poly. But then that doesn't really make sense for the rest of the scene because the rest of the scene looks a bit more realistic. And then also it looks like maybe you have some kind of Roman style pillars, and that doesn't really make sense with the sci-fi or the magical thing. So I would say pick one style and then go with that style, because I really just don't think it makes sense to go with all of these different styles here or all these different themes. So you could just go for like two styles or two themes. You could do the nature kind of in the background, and then the main subject, the character, and this building here, that could be sci-fi. So like the Roman pillars, I'd probably get rid of that, and the magical thing, it kind of looks a little bit sci-fi, but also a little bit magical or mysterious. You might want to make it look a little bit more sci-fi. And then the structure, I would also probably make the structure more sci-fi, but then the background and the environment could be the nature theme or style. Now for the nature, if you are going for realism for this scene, then I would get rid of the nature and replace it for some more photorealistic nature, because I feel like a lot of this nature doesn't look very realistic. It looks more like low poly. But I think just going for two themes or two styles would help. But I do really like the lighting that you used for this scene. I really like the blue lighting that you added. That looks really good. And then I also do really like the composition. I think the composition is really quite good. You have like this character right here, but then you also have this other element kind of here in the center or on the other rule of thirds. So that's the critique. I hope this was helpful, and thank you for sending this in. All right, so this next artwork comes from Pranav Dev. I do really like these kind of like low poly scenes where you can kind of see the whole room in just one little cube. So this is a really cool scene here. Let's go over how I would critique it. So I did notice that there's kind of like this big orange blur kind of right there. I don't know why it's there. So I would say figure out why that big blur is there and then just get rid of it, because it doesn't really make any sense and I don't know why it's there. Now on the background, I would probably just make it all one color. So you could just make it this dark purple color. I think that would be better than having some sort of material here, because this material, you can see like there's some different reflections and things, and I kind of feel like that takes away from the main scene. You really want to look at what's inside the cube. So I would say just make the background one color. And then also these books here, they all look like the exact same book, and that doesn't really make sense that if someone were living here, they would probably have some different books, because it doesn't really make sense that you would have like a dozen of the same book. So I would say just like change the texture of the book, and then that'll make it look like different books. Now these pillows here are very, very shiny, so they almost look like plastic pillows, and that just doesn't really make any sense. So I would try to make these pillows look a lot more soft, and then also I wouldn't make them shiny. I would make them quite a bit more rough on the roughness value, because cloth usually isn't very reflective. And then also I don't really know what that little brown tray is. It looks like maybe there's a brown tray kind of sitting on the ground, and then there's a plant on it. If it was a table, that would kind of make sense, but it doesn't have any table legs. It's just kind of sitting on the ground. So I would probably get rid of it. Now it also just doesn't really make sense to me that a wall would be made out of marble. That just doesn't really make any sense. I would probably use something different, like maybe some plaster or just like a painted wall or maybe a wooden wall. It just doesn't really make sense to me to have marble as a wall. Usually marble would be maybe like a tabletop on like a kitchen or something like that, but not for a wall in a bedroom. And then also I don't quite know what's going on over here, but it almost looks like there's something messed up with the geometry. I don't really know what this is. So I would say like check the geometry and maybe fix that, it almost looks like the doors here kind of got offset. You can see that like the door should start right over here, the door for this dresser. It should start like right over here, but it kind of looks like it got bumped over. And then also it looks like maybe the little door handles are floating, because you can see there's a shadow right there, and the shadow isn't actually touching where the door handle would be. So it looks like some things maybe got bumped around. So I would move these white doors back a little bit, and then also the little handles, I would push the handles in a bit. So that's the critique. So I think if you improve these things, then this would look really nice. So thank you for sending this in, and I hope the critiques were helpful. Alright, hopefully I'm pronouncing this right. So this next artwork comes from Jayesh Gotti, and you said that you wanted to know if there were any mistakes or anything that you could add to make the scene better. And you've added 2 files. One is a night scene, and then the other is a morning. So I think this one is the night scene, or maybe more the evening, and then this one is the day one. So this is a very cool scene here. I really like the ducks that you added. And also this grass right over here is really realistic, and you can see right over there, it's very realistic grass. So I really like that. And also you have some very nice trees here. And I really like the atmospheric feel. The scene really feels foggy. It feels like maybe there was some moisture in the air. Maybe some moisture was kind of coming up from the lake. So I really like that atmospheric look. So the first thing that I would do to critique this is that it looks like these ducks are the exact same duck. It looks like maybe you just took the duck model and duplicated it and moved it over, because the duck is in the exact same position and the texture is exactly the same. So what I would do is I would probably rig the duck. So you could just do some basic rigging, or maybe just model a different duck, and then I would change the pose, maybe rotate the duck, maybe change where the head is, maybe make the one duck looking away, maybe make one duck looking down, and then also changing the texture I think would help. So you might want to go with like a female duck and a male duck. I do think that they have different colors on their feathers, so maybe going with that, or really just changing the pose I think would really help. Now also I would make a little more variation in the trees, because pretty much all the trees look exactly the same, and it looks like you also have like some saplings right over here, some smaller trees, but they look exactly the same. All the trees look exactly the same, so I would make a little bit more variation. Like especially if I zoom in here, you can see that right here these look exactly the same. Like this piece is going up and then this piece is going up, so they just look exactly the same. So it would be much more realistic if you made maybe 3 or 4 trees and then you duplicated them, and then also if you give them a random rotation, that'll make the trees look even more different. I think the sizes are good, making some trees a little bit bigger and some trees a little bit smaller, but they all look like the exact same tree. Especially if you look right up on the top here, you can see that's exactly the same as that and that and that and that. So even just giving them a random rotation would really help, but I would make probably 3 or 4 different trees. Now I don't quite know how you created the scene, but it almost looks like there's some water going up here on the hill. It almost looks like the water's right here, and then like the water goes up and kind of goes up onto the hill, and that doesn't really make sense because the water would very quickly kind of fall down. So I would try to make the lake very, very flat. It just kind of looks like the water is coming up here and then kind of coming up over. So that doesn't really make sense. I don't quite know what's going on there, but I would try to fix that. And then also I would add some more detail in the water, because it is very, very smooth and very reflective, and that is realistic. But probably what I would do is I would go into the material and I would probably add a noise texture and then put it through the bump. And then I would just make it very, very, very subtle, so that it just gives a tiny bit of detail in there. I do like that you have a few little ripples. Like it looks like you have some ripples here around the duck. And that does look cool, especially like right there. There's a little tiny ripple and that does look cool, but I would probably go into the material and just all over, just add a tiny little bit more detail, just so that it looks like the water is moving just a little bit. And then you did add some ripples here around the ducks, and that does look cool, but it almost looks kind of sharp and jagged. You can see like kind of how sharp and jagged that is, like especially right here, there's kind of a jaggedy bit, and some more jaggedy bits there. So maybe adding a subdivision surface modifier would kind of smooth that out. Just do something to smooth out those jaggedy bits there on the water. And then also talking about like jaggedy bits, it does look like the ground over here is kind of blocky. It looks like I can see like a sharp edge right there, and also right here there are some sharp edges. So maybe adding a subdivision surface modifier to kind of smooth that out, or maybe you could go into sculpt mode and kind of smooth that out. But it looks like right here, kind of right over there, and also there, and also like right over here, there's just some really jaggedy bits. And in nature, dirt and ground isn't that sharp. It usually is pretty bumpy. So yeah, adding a subsurf modifier, maybe even adding like a displacement modifier, and then using like a procedural clouds to like displace it, and just making little bumps here and there. I think that would really help because it does look pretty sharp in some areas. And then also one other thing that I think would improve this is adding some rocks, because rocks are pretty much all over the place. Most nature scenes do have rocks, but it doesn't look like you really added any rocks. So probably what I would do is I would model a few different rocks, and then I would use a particle system on the ground, and I would add some rocks here and there. So I think doing all these things would really help, but this is a very cool render. So thank you for sending this in, and I hope the critiques were helpful. Alright, and this next artwork comes from Loud Blender, and you said that you created this for a Blender challenge. So this is a very cool scene here. I really do like this. I like the snowman. It's a very nice snowman. And then also I really like that you added those big clumps of like snow and ice on the trees. That is very cool. I think that looks pretty realistic. There are definitely some things that I would do to improve this, so let's go over that. So the first thing that I noticed is that the ice here, or the snow on the snowman, it's very high detail. If I zoom in here, you can see it's a very high detail, and it actually does look a lot like my procedural snow material. So if you did that tutorial, that's really cool. Thanks for doing that tutorial. But then right down here, this looks kind of icy, and it looks like it has very low detail. So I would say try to keep it more consistent. Now this is like packed snow, whereas this is a little bit more soft, but this almost looks like ice or something, and it's just very low detail, whereas this has a lot more detail. So I would try to keep the detail more consistent. So I don't know if you had two different textures, or maybe the scale was messed up. So if you were using the same texture, then what you could do is you could select all of these snow objects, and then you could press Control A and then apply the scale, and that way the scale is all going to be the same. And then you can go into the material, the procedural material, or maybe it was a texture, and just change the size of the texture so that the texture is all consistent around all of the snow objects. But I do really like the snow material that you added back here on the trees. I do think that looks really good. So just making the detail a little bit more consistent. And then also like these buttons here and like the eyes, they are very, very reflective. And I believe you were trying to make these look maybe like rocks or maybe like pieces of coal. But rock and coal are both very rough. And this looks very, very shiny. So I would make this a lot less shiny because it is super, super shiny. And I would also probably make it more detailed and bumpy. So maybe you could add like a procedural noise texture and just kind of make it a bit more rough and bumpy and make it less reflective. Now I would also add a lot more detail to this carrot because the carrot does look like it's just one material. So what you could do is you could go into sculpt mode and you can kind of sculpt the carrot and make it more detailed. Usually carrots have some little creases kind of going around the carrot. Or you could also maybe add in a carrot texture, or maybe you could do texture painting. Really just add some more detail in there because it doesn't have very much detail. And then also I think changing the grain of wood here on the sticks would really help, because it looks like the grain of wood here is all going in the same direction, but really the grain of wood does follow the sticks or follow the branches. So the grains of wood would probably go up here, or maybe they would kind of go around, but right now the grains of wood are all just going in the same direction. They're all just going back and forth like this, and that really just doesn't make sense because the grain of wood would probably be going up this way on that piece, but then it would kind of slant to the side and then kind of slant up. But right now all the grains of wood are just going in the same direction. So I think changing that would be really helpful. Now I would also add a fabric texture into the scarf because the scarf is pretty simple. It almost looks like maybe it's like a plastic scarf. So really you should add some sort of fabric texture. Even if you just downloaded a fabric texture and then used the bump map or the normal map and put that in just to give it a little bit of bumpiness and maybe making it a little bit more rough. And then also I did notice this. It actually took me a little while to notice it, but this stick right here is floating, so probably just push that back in there. That would help as well. So that's what I would do to improve this render, but this is really cool. So thank you for sending this in, and I hope the critiques were helpful. All right, and this next artwork comes from Blend Dreams. So Blend Dreams sent in this very cool artwork here. It looks like there's some snow on the ground, and then you have like a really cool cabin or something like that in the woods. I really like the rocks that you added. The rocks look really realistic, and then also the tree models look really good. That is really nice as well. Let's go over how I would improve this. So the first thing that I would do is I would remove the lens distortion, because I think lens distortions really only make sense in like sci-fi scenes, but for a natural kind of nature scene like this, I just really don't like lens distortions. You can see there on the edges, that's where the lens distortion is. So it kind of gives like a kind of a rainbow effect on the edges. But yeah, I feel like that only looks good on sci-fi scenes, so I would probably get rid of it. And then also adding bevels onto the house would really make it more photorealistic because on the edges there, it does look quite sharp. So I would just add a bevel modifier onto all those objects, and that would just make it more realistic. And then also inside the house there, it looks like maybe there's a bunch of snow that got in the house, or maybe this house just doesn't have a floor, and that doesn't really make sense. Probably any structure would have some sort of floor. So I would just add like a wooden floor, maybe just use the same material and just put a wooden floor on the ground. And then also I would lower the camera, because I think lowering the camera would actually make it feel a lot more realistic and a lot more real, because in real life, to be at this position where the camera is, you would probably need to be like flying overhead, or you would probably have to climb up in a tree to see the house from this high up, because you can especially see how high the trees are. But if you were like walking through the woods and you were walking up to this little building here, you would be a lot lower. You can especially see how big the door is. That's almost the size of a person. So I would move the camera way down to about a average person's height. And that way it'll make the scene feel much more realistic, because it'll actually feel like you could be in the scene kind of walking up to the house. And then also it looks like these boards are floating a little bit, because I can see around the edges. I can see kind of back in there. I can see the back of the wall there. So it looks like these boards are floating. So that doesn't really make any sense. So I would scale the boards up so that you can't see around the edges of them. And then also just one more thing that I thought of, it is really bright inside the cabin or inside the building, and that doesn't really make any sense unless maybe someone had a lantern or something inside it, or maybe a flashlight. But it does look like it has a lot of daylight. You can see right in here behind the door, you can see that it has this very bright blue light, and I just don't really think that makes sense. You could have maybe some light inside the cabin if maybe there was a lantern or something, but the color of light of like a lantern or a flashlight or something would probably be a lot more yellow colored, but the light inside here looks a lot more like the daylight from the sky, because it's very light and it's very blue colored. So probably what I would do is I would just make it a lot darker. Maybe you added a light inside the cabin or the house. I would probably just remove that. If you wanted to make it look like maybe someone was in here, or maybe someone lit up something inside the house, then I would probably add a slightly yellow colored light. And that would make it look a lot more like firelight or a flashlight or a lantern or something like that. So that's what I would do to improve the scene, but this is really cool. So thank you for sending this in, and I hope the critiques were helpful. All right, and this next artwork comes from Andy123. So this is a very cool architecture scene. I really do like it. I really like the models that you use. That's very cool. And also the textures are very nice as well. Let's go over how I would critique this. So I do feel like the lighting could really be improved, because the scene is very gray and very boring, and the light is just kind of white and black, and the shadows are also just have no color to them. So what I would do is I would add an HDRI lighting. So HDRI lighting really helps to make it more photorealistic, because HDRIs have all this color data and they're images from the real world. So adding in an HDRI I think would really help to make it more photorealistic. And a really great website to get tons of free HDRIs is polyhaven.com. So I'll leave a link in the description if you'd like to check out Polyhaven. Now I would also move the camera down, because I feel like with how high the camera is, if someone were to see this from where the camera is, they would probably need to stand on like a step stool or something, especially if you compare it to how big the couch is. It just seems like this is pretty high. It's a little bit higher than the average person. So I would probably move the camera down, or even move it farther down closer to the floor. And I think that would make it feel a lot more realistic, because someone could actually see it from that view. But with how it is right now, it seems like someone would probably need to like stand on a chair or stand on a stool to see the scene from that high up. So it is just slightly too high, so I would move it down a little bit. Now on the rug here, I would go into the particle edit, and then I would comb the particles, because right there where the arrow is pointing, you can see that the particles are kind of going through this coffee table right here. So I would go into the particle edit and just comb the particles out of the way so they're not going through the coffee table. And then I would also just add more stuff, because right now there's only like 3 things after the furniture. You can see there's this little lamp here, and then also it looks like maybe there's a newspaper, and then also right over here there's a little plant, but this is pretty simple, and there also is just like an empty wall right here in the corner of the room. So I would just add more stuff. I wouldn't fill the entire scene with lots of stuff, but I would probably double or triple the amount of stuff. So just add some more things, maybe add a lamp there right here on the shelf. Maybe also just add 1 or 2 more pieces of furniture, and then maybe just add a few more things, like maybe you could add some pillows there on the sofa. Maybe you could add 1 or 2 more items on the table as well. Just adding a few more things would help to make the scene more interesting. Now also, this scene does feel very enclosed. It almost feels like you're trapped inside this little scene here. So what I would do is I would probably add a window so that you can look outside and see more nature. I think adding in a window really helps architecture scenes to look more realistic and look a bit more natural. Because there are no windows in this scene, it does feel very enclosed. It feels like you're just kind of stuck in this very little room. But if you add a window with maybe some trees in the background or something like that, or maybe just even making the room a little bit more spacious, or adding a little bit more natural light, maybe even adding just a couple of plants here and there, that would all really help to make the scene feel a bit more spacious and also a bit more natural. So maybe just adding a window, or maybe adding in some more natural lighting, or just adding in a couple more plants. So that's what I would do to improve this. So thank you, Andy123, for sending this in, and I hope the critiques were helpful. Alright, and this next artwork comes from Varun Doshi. So this is a really cool artwork here. I really like that you use the Blender Suzanne monkey head, and then it looks like maybe there's like a scientist right here, and then he's like looking at some computers or some screens, and I like all the details that you added in here. These textures are really good, and I like the sci-fi stuff, and also this atmospheric lighting is really cool. It looks like maybe you added in some fog or something like that. Very cool. And you said that you feel comfortable with modeling, but you get stuck while making the environment. And you said that lighting the scene is where you struggle the most. So I will go over some of those things in the critique. So if you want to improve the lighting, then I would highly recommend using an HDRI for the lighting. So I'll leave a link in the description to polyhaven.com if you'd like to check out their HDRIs. They have a bunch of free, really high quality HDRIs that you can use for your projects. And what's so great about using HDRIs is they have tons of different colors, and they're really great for like reflective objects to reflect the lighting, and they have accurate color and world data. So I light almost all of my scenes with HDRIs. I do use other lights as well, like you can totally add in other lights as well, but I do use HDRIs for almost all my scenes, and they're really helpful. Now also, I would point the light at the main subject. So you're kind of doing that right here, but I would probably light it a little bit more, not too much. It is kind of cool that the Suzanne face is kind of like dark in shadow, and then that red really pops out, and it kind of makes it look a bit more mysterious. So that is cool. I might add just a little bit more of a rim light and just make it a little bit lighter overall. So basically, you want to point the light at whatever you want people to look at. So I think this monkey right here is the main subject, and then this is sort of like a secondary element, this scientist or this person here. So really, I would just point the lighting right there, make it maybe a little bit brighter, and maybe add a rim light. It is pretty good that you added this light right here, but I would probably just make it a little bit brighter. Now, one really big thing that I think would really improve this is actually changing the composition. So what I did is I just went into Blender and I just set up this really quick scene right here, and I think this composition would definitely be better. So I'm using the rule of thirds because I do have the main monkey head right here, and it's really big and it's kind of in the center of the scene, but it's off a little bit to the side in the rule of thirds. And then this scientist character is kind of over here in the other rule of thirds. Now also, this gives the scene a lot more depth because the monkey head is the main subject, and then kind of in the background, the secondary element is this character here, and it gives more depth because there's kind of some stuff farther back in the room, and you can see there are some stairs walking up to get into the back of the room. And then of course you can add the lighting and all the different sci-fi things, but I think this composition would really improve the render. So here's my composition idea with your render. So I think that my composition idea does give a lot more depth to the scene because your scene is kind of flat. There's just all the different things here. There's the character with the monitors in the background and then the monkey head, but everything is kind of next to each other, whereas right down here you could have the monkey head closer up, and that way you could see more of the details of like the textures and things, and then kind of farther back the character would be in the background. So I do think this composition would improve it. So if you want to go ahead and change that, maybe try it and see what you think. And of course, this is just a really quick thing I put together, but you would add more sci-fi details, and you could also add like some railing to walk up the stairs and things like that, kind of like how you have in your image. Now I would also add a depth of field. So right in here, if I go back to this one, I would add a depth of field and make the focus be on the monkey head. That way, things in the background are just blurred a little bit, and then also things really close up, like on the ground here, are just slightly blurred. It wouldn't need to be too strong, but that way the main focus would be on the monkey head, and then you would still be able to see this character, but it would just be a little bit more blurred because he's a little bit more in the background. And then it does look like you added a glare in Blender's Compositor, so that is really good. It looks like all this stuff is kind of glowing a bit, and this is glowing, or maybe that was just like the foggy stuff that you added into the scene, but I do think that's really good. It adds a lot to the scene. And then also just a few more ideas, some things that you might want to add is maybe adding in some sci-fi textures on the metal walls. Now you wouldn't want to add like tons of detail because that would be kind of noisy and take away from the main scene, but you might just want to add maybe some bolts or just a basic metal texture on the walls. So you said that you do get stuck sometimes on making the environment and then also lighting the scene. So I think changing the composition, that would really help to make the environment better. And I do think the lighting is pretty good as well, but I would just make it a bit brighter and really center the light on whatever the main focus is. And in this scene, the main subject is this monkey head. So maybe add another rim light just to kind of brighten things up and just really point the light right at the monkey head. Of course, if you want to make the monkey head look a bit more mysterious, you could definitely make this kind of dark, like the front of the monkey head, and then the eyes glowing kind of makes it more mysterious. So this is a really cool render, and I think if you just did those things, then this would be really nice. So thank you for sending this in, and I hope the critiques were helpful. Alright, and this next artwork comes from Jeremy G. And you said you'd like to know how you can make it more realistic, and then also you were wondering how you can improve the textures. So this is a very cool sci-fi scene. I really like the background that you added with the stars, and then you have this cool thing here with like these glowing orb things. And I like the compositing that you added. You added these cool like glare things. That looks very cool. And also it looks like you did one of my procedural material tutorials, so that is very cool as well. So the first thing that I was thinking is this a planet? Because it does kind of look like a planet. Maybe it's like a moon or something, because it looks mostly flat, but then there are also some hills and things. But then if this is a planet, or maybe this is a moon, or maybe this is like a big asteroid, then why would you be able to see the stars down here? It just doesn't really make sense. So what I would do is I would make this a lot bigger and maybe just have this be like a giant asteroid in space with some hills and things, or maybe this is like a small planet, or maybe this is like a moon. But it doesn't really make sense that there would be something like this floating in space. Like it almost looks like there's just a flat ground and then there's like some hills, but then there's space kind of right out here underneath it. So it doesn't have much depth. It's not very thick. But I was also thinking this might be like an asteroid belt or something, because you can see there's a bunch of asteroids here and little rocks and things. So that is cool. But this main landmass isn't really the shape of an asteroid because it's kind of flat and then suddenly it has these hills. So I would probably make this look like maybe a small moon and just make this all be ground, and then you could add these asteroids kind of floating around if you wanted to. Now I was also wondering what these spheres are. So maybe they are planets, or maybe they're like a sun. If they're a sun, then I would probably change the material to a very, very bright material, because stars or suns are very, very light and you wouldn't really be able to see those dark patches. And then also if I zoom in here, you can see that it is a little bit lumpy, but planets are very, very big. And so if this was a planet or a sun, you wouldn't really be able to see any lumps because they're so big that they just look perfectly smooth, because the little bumps and things are so small compared to the size of the planet. So I would probably make that a lot more smooth, and then also I would change the material. Now I do really like some of these rock textures. Like I think this texture is pretty cool, and this texture is kind of cool. But then some of these textures I don't really like too much, like especially right down here. I just don't really think this fits at all. So I would probably change this out for a dirt texture or a rock texture. Now you could make something procedural, maybe make a procedural rock texture or a procedural dirt texture. I have tutorials on how to make procedural dirt and procedural rock. Or you could also go onto a website like Ambient CG or CG Bookcase, and you could add a actual rock texture or dirt texture onto these models. And then also, I think these cool orb things are the main focus of the scene. And so because they're the main focus, I would put them much more in the center, or maybe just on one of the rule of thirds. But they're really quite far away. They're kind of like over here. I would probably move it right over here and make it more in the center of the scene. And then also I would probably move the camera in a bit and kind of have this kind of on the side as like a secondary element. And then you could also put these maybe a little bit farther back and a little bit smaller in the background. And then if you wanted to take some of these rocks and things and just kind of move them in or move them maybe farther back here, kind of floating out in space, I think that would help. I think that would really help the composition to look better. But I do really like this cool orb thing that you made, these cool crystals. I really like that procedural material. If that is a procedural material, it does look really cool. It kind of looks like a purplish glass. So that is very cool. And then you were also wondering how to make it look more realistic. I think adding rocks in would really help, and you did add rocks in, so that is very cool. But also it does look like you added in some little bits of grass, and that doesn't really make sense that way out here in space there would be grass. For grass to be able to be alive and grow, it would need some sort of atmosphere. It would need oxygen. It would also need like heat. So I would probably get rid of the grass. And then also maybe you could add in like some more boulders, maybe add in some boulders around the scene. I think that would help it to be more realistic. But I do feel like this is kind of a hard scene to make it look realistic because it is very science fiction. But you could, of course, try to improve the lighting and some things like that to make it more realistic. So that's the critique. I think changing those things would definitely help this image. So thank you for sending this in, and I hope this was helpful. Alright, and we are coming towards the end of this art critique, so this last one here comes from Nolic. So this is a very cool scene here. I like that you added like this dust kind of in the atmosphere on the ground, and then you have like these cool rocks here, and I really like the rock texture that you use. That's very cool. And I do think the composition is quite good overall, because you have this cool like portal thing kind of right here in the center, but a little bit more to the side, so that kind of fits with the rule of thirds. That's really great. I definitely have some critiques though, so let's go over that. So something that I noticed is that the fire looks exactly the same. So I don't know if you used a texture or maybe you simulated it, but it looks exactly the same on both sides. So I would probably change that. If it's a texture, maybe you could find a different texture, or maybe you could mirror the texture. Or if you simulated it, then maybe just simulate it a little bit longer on one of them so that it looks a little bit different. Now, I would also add quite a bit more light to the scene. If you want to have it look like a dark scene, then that's totally great. You could do that. But the main subject of the scene should have enough light that you can clearly see what it is. And I do think this is some sort of like portal or something, some sort of archway, but it is quite dark. So I would make it a bit brighter, maybe add a rim light, or maybe add some kind of light on it, or maybe it could be glowing a little bit more. Just adding some light to it so you can see it a little bit better. Now, as far as the archway goes, I'm not quite sure if you were trying to go for more of a sci-fi look or more of an ancient look. Because you can see there's like these cubes here, and these cubes look like they have a gold material on them. And so that kind of makes sense with the rest of the scene, because it looks like some sort of cave or something, some ancient cave. And maybe this is like a golden artifact or a golden statue or something. And so that kind of fits along with this cave scene. But then you have these like sci-fi bits with all these little sci-fi details. And so I feel like it doesn't really quite fit. I do think it's cool that you have like the environment be more ancient or more organic with all the rocks and like the clay pots and the different things like that and the fire. But I think the archway portal thing should probably be just sci-fi. So I would probably get rid of these gold pieces and change it for more sci-fi elements to really make that stand out and make it look more sci-fi. And then of course adding more light to it would really help, because it is pretty dark and it's kind of hard to see exactly what it is. And then also adding a glare in Blender's compositor would really help to make the fire look like it's glowing a little bit. And then also maybe some of these sci-fi bits, if you added a glare, that would make it look like it was glowing. And also it looks like maybe you have some like blue light kind of in here in the center of the portal or the archway. So if you didn't add a glare node, I think adding a glare node in Blender's compositor would help as well. And then just one last thing I wanted to go over. I don't really quite know what this is. It sort of looks like it's a metal box because it's so shiny and reflective, but then right over here it looks like maybe you added a marble material. I'm not quite sure, or maybe it's like a rock pillar, so I'm not really quite sure what this is. And then it does look like really rough and chunky right here, almost like the object wasn't shaded smooth, and maybe that's some of the vertices, some of the faces. So I don't quite know what this is. I would probably get rid of it or make it more clear what it is. Alright, and that is it for the critique for this artwork. So thank you for sending this in, and I hope the critiques were helpful. And with that critique finished, this is going to wrap it up for this Blender art critique video. So thank you everyone for sending in your artworks, and I hope you find the critiques helpful. And if you'd like to be in the next art critique video, then you could submit it through the Google form. I'll have the link in the description. So thanks for watching everyone, and I hope to see you in a future video.